Hey everyone, Pastor Adam here.
And Pastor Bob. It's good to be back with you guys.
Yeah.
And with you, Adam.
Well, always good to be with you, Bob. Everybody needs to know that it's Pastor Bob's 50th birthday today. He's officially old. So we can't party because of the COVID virus. But everybody wish him a happy birthday whenever you see this, even if it's belated. He needs all the support he can get in his 50th. So today we're going to watch the last of the Unafraid series. It's number 5. And you're always welcome to give us feedback on what you think about this. Also want to remind those of us in both of our churches that we're starting an online small group, which is going to be starting Thursday night. What is today? April 30th.
It is Wednesday right now.
Thank you. It's going to be tomorrow, but you might not even watch this until tomorrow. Right? If you want to join us, it's just an introduction. You don't have to commit. We're just going to explain what we're going to try to do. And if it's for you, great. If not, that's all good too. We love you no matter what. So just wanted to put that plug out there. Pastor, you got anything you need to say?
That's awesome. Nope. Thank you for the happy birthday.
Yeah, happy birthday. All right, well, let's watch our last one here. Here we go. Aging perfectly.
Aging!
Well, this is our last session together and our last conversation together about the things that we're afraid of and how we live unafraid with courage and hope in uncertain times. And we're going to talk about some of the most universal of fears. If you go back and study Buddhism, you find this was the beginning of the Buddhist quest for enlightenment, was the fear of growing old, the fear of getting sick, the fear of dying. And then ultimately we're going to end, the book ends by looking at the fear of the Lord, how when we put our trust in God, somehow that addresses and affects all of these other fears. So fear of growing old, and you know, it's interesting, in the book I mentioned this, that folks who are the happiest people in many of the surveys that have been taken across the country are those who are in their late 70s up into their 80s. And you just think, how interesting is that? Our assumption is that your happiest years are when you're in your 20s or 30s, but instead somehow when you're in your 80s, those folks on self-reported surveys are happier than the folks who are younger. They've learned things, they've gained wisdom, their sense of need to achieve or accomplish has really fundamentally changed. But I want to take just a second to really focus on this idea of the fear of sickness and our worry or anxiety around our health. And Ginger, I know that's been an issue for you. Why don't you say a little bit about that?
So 15 years ago, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and it's mostly been in remission for 15 years, but it's in and out, and it's medically controlled to keep MS quiet. But, 5 years ago, I couldn't walk unassisted. I had a bad relapse and steroids weren't working and infusions weren't addressing it. And I really had to face, this may not get better. This one may not reverse. And so it was the fear of not only change, the way that I was living life was going to change, but what does this mean to everybody else around me? It's a change for my husband. It's a change for my children. And I remember coming upon Jeremiah line of, I knew you in the womb, and, God calling Jeremiah to his purpose. And it struck me of like, okay, so no matter what happens, God knows me. I'm not necessarily a person with MS in God's eyes. I'm a person who might be able to teach something to people, or a person that might be able to show faith despite major setbacks. And so just that message of Jeremiah's call story indicated to me, I know you, I know what you're thinking, I know what you're about to say, and I've got you no matter what your body does. And so it just felt like, use it then, God. And I really surrendered of, okay, so what do you want to do with this? And that's the time that I was feeling the call to seminary and the call to learn so you can teach. And MS got better. So I'm currently in remission, but I have that looming always, always that it could come back. But I don't live in fear as much because I know even if I'm not okay, it's going to be okay.
So for you, it sounds like you gave that to God. It sounds like that you invited God to bring okay, this may not change. I'm going to seek medical treatment. I can be terrified of it, or I can say, God, take it and use it. And that's exactly what's happening in your life.
And there's no alternative in my eyes.
Right. What is the alternative?
Yeah, what is
right?
the alternative?
Be
God,
terrified all the
let's
time.
do something with this.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. How about either of you? Have you had a moment where you were afraid of whether there was an anxiety or panic or worry related to health?
My mother suffers from severe arthritis rheumatoid, and it wasn't until like a couple of years that I started kind of having a little bit of the symptoms. And I actually noticed it while playing guitar at church one time, and I realized like my hand wasn't responding as I wanted to, and immediately I was completely in panic. I was so afraid because I started thinking about the genetics of how I might be carrying the same sort of illness, and so and it was very terrifying to think about that I would end as I see her struggling with her illness.
Yes, absolutely. Any struggles you've had, worries, anxieties, fears around health? Or
I see some older people that are able to jump flips, and I'm not able to. And so, like, what's your secret for life, for living, so that you can get the best out of life? And I seek to get that wisdom from them of what I need to do to maintain the best possible me that I can. When I see, I'll be concerned about how much things are going to cost the older I get. And when I step away from working, will I be able to maintain my livelihood and care for myself, afford medication, afford to go to the doctor, afford to do the things that keep me healthy.
I want to shift gears. So obviously the fear of getting sick is, and the worry that goes along with that is prevalent. And of course, most of the time, the things we fear in that area never come to pass. We,
Right.
or in your case, you have MS, but you have been in remission. Let's talk about the fear of death. And here, I guess I'd like to ask, you're all three doing pastoral ministry. And so where do you see, in the people that you minister with, where have you confronted the fear of death? And how do you confront it?
I feared death less because of being a pastor with people in those last minutes. That has been the gift of ministry to me, because I had a huge fear of death. And part of my list of things I wanted to get answers to in seminary, that was one of them. What happens when we die? What's this afterlife all about? And so I've struggled with that. But being in someone's presence when they take their last breath, and you feel that spirit rising, and people in the room are like, did you feel that? There's something happening beyond our ability to explain it or understand it. But I fear death less, having been with people in their last moments.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. In my pastoral ministry, I've seen the same. We're wrapping up our time together.
All right. Let's pause.
Yeah, I was about to ask you to pause.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. You want to go first? Yeah.
Well, no, and she was talking about her fear of death. I don't, it was interesting because my experience isn't so much that I fear my fear of death isn't about what I don't know happening to me, right? That's not where my fear comes from. Anytime I think of dying, what I fear is what I'll miss. Like I think of my kids, and I think of the lives that that they will lead, and I think of the possibilities that they'll have, and that's what I fear right now as a father and a husband. I don't fear what's going to happen to me. I fear what I would miss out on. So it's not like I've never really given much thought to like that idea of what's the what the afterlife is. That's not something that's it's never been a big thing on my mind, so it's never been a huge question for me. And I can't explain why, it just hasn't. So
I mean, when I was thinking about this, I agree. I'm not as afraid of dying myself as I am of, well, number one, because we both have young kids. I'm afraid of leaving leaving them behind or leaving them without resources, those kinds of things. I'm also, I guess I'm at the same time, I'm afraid of eventually becoming a burden on my kids.
Yeah.
A financial burden or an emotional burden, or that they, they have to care for me around the clock. I get that, that's part of what kids do for their parents sometimes. And hopefully I'll have a good enough relationship with them that they'll do it. But I don't want that kind of life for them at the same time. And I don't know how to get around that. So yeah, and I wanted to talk about the moment of death for many people, which is this passing into the unknown. And obviously what happens in that moment is mysterious and beautiful. I would say that, having also been with families and people in their dying moments, that it has always been a mixture of holiness and sacredness, and sadness, and relief. I mean, there's just that moment, and it kind of overwhelms you in that. And but I'm not afraid of that moment anymore, because, as was mentioned, I've been in the room when that happens, and it's not scary, and it's not even painful for the most part. Right?
Yeah, that's my experience, has always been. Well, not always. It has usually been this sacred moment of release. I always feel like, in the midst of it, I feel blessed to have been there. I recognize how lucky, in a sense, I am to be invited into that very, that very personal moment in the life of a family. And there's that piece of me when I'm there where I'm like, God, I don't belong here.
Yes.
What?
There's always that.
Things,
you all should know that pastors, we're like, why am I here? I can't really do it.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. I don't. It's always interesting to be with people who are afraid to die. I remember having a conversation with a woman, and this is one of my favorite conversations. There was a woman, she was about 100. She was like 101 years old. I don't know. She was, and she had a friend that she had, who had come into her life when she was in her 70s, and he was like 20 years younger than her. And they had been together for this whole time. And when I asked her because like she was really struggling and near death for several days, and I finally asked her what she was afraid of. And what was so funny to me was she wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of this 85-year-old man not being able to take care of himself.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
And it was like this beautiful, like, loving thing to say.
Right.
But again, I kind of giggled. I did. I laughed and said, well, I think he'll be all right. He's 85 and he's here in this nursing home where you are, where they'll help take care of him. And so my experience of being in those moments has been, people are more afraid of what they're leaving behind than what they're going to.
Yes, absolutely true.
So,
yeah. And maybe this is pertinent for some people or not, but just a shout out to hospice, for example, or anybody who cares for a family and someone who's in their dying days, their last days. They are very good at walking people through the process of a body shutting down, but also the beginning of the process of grief that people experience. Even before someone dies, of course, grief can start. And and that's a real thing, and it's okay, And I think that's part of what we're afraid of too, is the pain of it all.
Right.
And not just the physical pain, because we go through physical pain, but the emotional pain that we don't know what to do with. And as I tell people, grief is weird, and there's no right way to grieve. You just have to, but you do have to grieve. You can't not do it. So, It'll come out in one way or another.
It'll catch up.
It'll
Yep,
catch up. Yeah.
for sure.
All right. Are you afraid of getting older on your 50th birthday?
That was awesome.
That was awesome.
Like we waited for this moment.
I know.
You know, it's such a weird thing. No, you know, like I'm not, um, I mean, 50 is like weird.
Mhm.
It's, you know, in a way, I don't know why, but it is. But no, I remember being much more traumatized, I think, when I turned like 30
Yes.
for whatever reason
When you're
than I am by this.
Yes. When you're out of your 20s and then you're 30 and you still don't feel like you're grown up and you're like, what am I doing with my life and what's going on and all this stuff.
Well, I'm 50 and I still feel that way, Adam, but
Right.
thank you.
You're welcome.
I just don't care
Add to
anymore.
your fears.
I just don't care that I'm that way.
See, you've accepted who you are. I
Right.
like it. Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, no, I'm, it's not like I fear growing old. I mean, it is interesting though. Like we were driving in the car, Rosie and I, and this might, you know, most people might be like, oh my gosh, you can't, but we were talking and, she asked me about turning 50. And I said, you know, the only weird thing about it is when I kind of look, and think about it, like take time to think about it. I realized that really, I only have like 35 to 40 years left,
Mhm.
you know?
Mhm.
And I know that, you know, that's a kind of a morbid way to look at it, but that's the only time where I'm like, oh my gosh, you know, I'm, you know, I'm where there's even a mild sense of fear, but you know, no, I'm not I'm in, yeah, I'm enjoying like watching my kids get older.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I'm not gonna. Yeah, so you know, I don't see myself going out and buying a sports car anytime soon.
Right. Yeah. So you can experience your midlife crisis in a different way.
Yeah, that's true. I'll just buy a bigger van.
Yeah, there you go. I want to say one more thing. They didn't really they kind of touched on health concerns, that kind of thing, but
Right.
and we talked about this, I think, in the first Unafraid video, but there are some valid fears, right?
Mhm.
That it's okay to be afraid of the virus and to mitigate that fear, wash your hands and cover your mouths and wear the mask, and it's okay. Like that's normal. Just like we
Well,
talked about, it's okay to be afraid of getting hit by a bus. Like don't
well,
step out front of a
what
bus.
was it? What was the acronym? Was it fear or was it faith? I forget. The fact, you know, get the facts,
Get the
take
fact.
action.
Yes. Well, we're such bad leaders. We forgot already. We'll have to go back to the last one and figure it out. But yeah.
So I mean, you know, I think part of when we're afraid, but then there are like, you know, her talking about MS, you know, you look at kind of what she's come through and you're like, well, I'm, you know, the thing I'm wondering about is she's looking back and she's feeling like, and she's had, it would appear, and I'm not, she has, she's able to kind of navigate the world in a fairly normal way, right?
Mhm.
And so in some ways she can look back and say, I was trusting in God, you know?
Mhm.
My question to her would be, tell me about those times where you just really didn't,
Right.
where you didn't feel like God was there, when you did feel really like completely and totally out of control and afraid,
Yeah.
because that's what illness does, you know, like even like when you're just, when you get the stomach flu, right? You've lost control.
Yes.
You don't have control over what's happening. And I think that's what, like, that's the fear of, for me, of getting something more than just the stomach flu, but like of cancer or some, you know, or whatever, MS, just kind of you lost control, and wanting to grab it back. And what do I do? How do I get it? So
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because, and she alluded to this, but sometimes with our physical diseases, we get reduced to them. Like
Yeah.
you're just a cancer patient, which is clearly not true, or she's just somebody
Right.
who is who suffers from MS or arthritis or whatever it is, right? And even this is even happening today, where all of those people who have died of COVID, that's all we know about them, is that they're just a number, a statistic, that they are the ones who died of COVID. And that's of course absolutely not true about who we are. We are not reduced to our diseases. There's so much more about us, but those pains and those diseases seem to take over our identities, at least for a while. And that's terrifying. I don't want to be just known as, I want to be Pastor Adam. I want to be Adam.
Adam, right? The whole thing.
The whole thing. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, because it's like, you know, there are things, I guess, that you could define me with that would not be so flattering. So there are some people who do.
Let me give you a yeah.
And but recognizing, sometimes it is hard for us to recognize that people are more than just whatever, that definition and that label that we've given them. And we do it all the time with all kinds of things, though, not just illness. We label people we label people all the time.
That's all we do. Yeah.
And then when we label them, we make them, in a sense, less than their whole self.
Absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
All right. Should we keep going? Let's do it.
In this conversation, but it just strikes me that in the Christian faith, the Easter hope, the belief that Christ came, he suffered and died, and he rose from the dead, was God's way of saying, of addressing this fundamental fear in our lives, that even death doesn't have the final word, and that ultimately we live. Because I live, Jesus said, you shall live also, therefore you don't have to be afraid. This has been such a meaningful conversation for me, and I know for the people at home. I want to thank you for giving your time to come together and talk about our fears and how we live unafraid with courage and hope in uncertain times. It has been great. God bless each of you, and thank you again for being a part of the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, as we come to the close of our last session together, I'm really excited to have the person who inspired my writing this book, at least one of them. And that is my wife and my best friend and the mother of our children. A sign language interpreter is her career, Levon Hamilton. And Levon, thank you for joining me. I know this is outside your comfort zone to sit in front of a camera, but I really felt like your story and your wrestling with anxiety was important in thinking about fear. And so I wondered if you might just say a little bit about what happened back in 1996 and your wrestling with anxiety.
Okay, well, I was in my mid-30s at the time, and we had 2 young children, and I got into a pattern of feeling completely obsessed with whether I was healthy or not, if there was something wrong with me. And I started worrying that there was something wrong with me. And as that continued, my heart would race and my palms would get all sweaty, and I felt like there's something seriously wrong. And throughout that process, I ended up in the emergency room several times thinking that this is an emergency, there's warning signs going off in my head, and I need to go get help. And as we continued to go through that process, I had a lot of tests done physically to figure out what's wrong with my body. And they never could find anything. And as people would say, well, have you ever thought about the fact that this might be anxiety? Are you anxious about something? And I would look at my life and I think, well, I don't have anything to be anxious about. I have 2 young children and a husband who's a workaholic and never home, and a career. And of course, there's nothing to be. My life is very relaxed. But I didn't pick up on the fact that this was fear and anxiety. And it was a cycle that I couldn't get out of.
It's interesting how many people wrestle with anxiety and panic. You've had conversations with folks, you've spoken about this before. How did you finally find deliverance from that overbearing, overwhelming, oppressive anxiety?
First of all, I had to make sure that there was nothing physically wrong with me. I had to go to the doctor and have the test run and then come to the point of saying, okay, I have to trust the fact that this doctor is telling me there's nothing wrong with me. So now what do I do? This is not something physical. Now let's focus on the mental part of it. And that was a long process. It was probably 2 years before I felt like I'm kind of back to my normal self. But it required me going to counseling. It required me talking to other people who had been through the same thing and realizing that, okay, these symptoms I'm feeling are the same things that someone with anxiety is feeling. I read books about fear and anxiety, and it helped identify those things within my life, and helped identify my personality traits so that I recognize the fact that I'm more prone to worry and to anxiety. It required medication and willpower and just a lot of work to get back to the point where I felt at peace again.
So I remember those moments where, you know, you were anxious about leaving the house or going to church or being around groups of people, and certainly not flying or going somewhere out of town, or me being out of town. I needed to be there with you. But I also remember the first time we got on an airplane, you know, a couple years later. Actually, I remember before that, you flying to England by yourself. And I didn't think that would ever happen. And to see, you know, and today I look back and I think you're not the same person at all. But to see the progress, and I think there's a lot of people when they're in the middle of anxiety feel like there's no hope, I'm never going to get better. Did you feel that way at times?
Oh, definitely. It was all I could do to get into the car and go pick the kids up from school. And I mean, I was to that point where I couldn't do anything by myself. And I thought I felt like I was in this pit that I couldn't get out of. And I thought that it's never going to be any better. And it's better to just kind of check out of the world. I mean, I really got to the point where I didn't want to go on because I had no hope that it was going to get better. And it takes time, and having to just realize that you can get on the other side of it, that you're not destined to be in that dark place forever, that through work and faith, you can get on the other side.
Well, I stand in awe of what's happened and the strength and the amazing, you have a strength of personality that I don't think you see or understand. And to overcome what you went through, to me, is heroic. So I'm grateful, and was grateful for you to come and sit here with me. I want to ask you one last question, and that is, what role did faith play in your overcoming anxiety, and what role does it continue to play in your life?
Well, faith is a big part of overcoming anxiety. Even someone who doesn't necessarily believe in God, you have to have faith that it's going to get better, as we talked about before, that you're not going to stay in this dark place. You have to have faith that it'll be better. You have to have faith if it's a physical concern that everything's going to be okay, that the doctor is telling you. You have to believe in what they're saying. And mostly for me, as a person of faith, I had to remember that my life is not my own, that my life is in the hands of my Savior, and that I have to let go of any false control that I might have, and know that my life is in His hands ultimately.
The 4 steps that I've been teaching in this book, the acronym for fear, you've really captured them all in this. Face your fears with faith. Examine your assumptions in the light of the facts, which is, you know, having the doctors look everything over to see what was happening. Attack your fears with action, which is exactly what you did in counseling and finding people to talk to. And then finally, release your fears to God. And in so many ways, that acronym and those 4 steps are what I've seen played out in your life. I want to end this session by just challenging you and inviting you to be able to trust in God, to be able to release your fears to God, to do all of these steps and to find all of the resources available outside of your faith. But certainly when it comes to faith, to be able to trust in God. And I think about this, the closing chapter in the book is about the fear of the Lord. And that fear is being awestruck by God, by being awestruck by the power of God, that God is so much greater and bigger than anything you're facing, and that you trust in Him, and that evil and sin and hate and sickness and even death will never have the final word in your life. And then to be able to trust, just this idea that God is holding you and near and will not let you go, I think is so profound. And I want to tell one last story here before we wrap it up, and that is that's our dog Maybelle. So we have this beautiful, cute little dog. She's 7 or 8 pounds, and she's terrified when there's thunderstorms. And I mentioned this in the book. She gets really scared, or if there's fireworks going off, and she's trembling, and she hides under the bed in the farthest reaches of the house. And Levon, you had this idea. You read something about the thunder jacket, and that if you put her in this jacket and wrap her up real tight, it has Velcro and it just holds her tight, that she wouldn't be afraid. And you told me about this, and I thought, that is the nuttiest thing I've ever heard. There's no way that's going to work. And sure enough, you wrap this thing around her, And on the 4th of July, when the fireworks were going off, she wasn't afraid. She was totally calm because she felt like she was being held. And it strikes me that that's precisely what happens when we have our faith in Christ. We trust that he holds us. He doesn't let us go. And somehow we begin to find, when we release our lives to him, a peace that passes all understanding to guard our hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And when we have that, we can live unafraid with courage and hope. That's my hope and prayer for you.
All right. Well, first of all, their chemistry as husband and wife was giving me anxiety because it was just really awkward. It's like, what's going on here? It was just so robotic, or kind of, I don't know. It was just,
I don't want to be here, but
yeah,
you're making me do
it
this.
was something like that, you know? So that was just kind of like, okay. And they didn't smile at each other. There was just like nothing going on there. It was just weird. So I'm just going to throw that out there. That was causing me anxiety. So full disclosure, I'm someone who deals with anxiety in my life too. So I've had panic attacks. I know what that feels like. It absolutely feels like you are dying and you need to go to the hospital immediately. So I could resonate with what she was saying. I am someone who also has been on anxiety medication or been through counseling to work on those anxieties because those things are real. And then, and this is for anybody who's out there, because you know, a lot of people deal with anxiety on extreme levels or on smaller levels, but of course, prayer and talking to God, that's the faith component, along with a regular practice of breathing, of being quiet with God. You don't have to do all the talking all the time, but just what the world is calling mindfulness right now, but has been the practice of faithful people for a really long time of all spiritual traditions, is just breathe and be still. That really helps anxiety, all of those things combined. And I don't know, Pastor, if you've dealt with anxiety in your own life, but I know you have with
I know you have. Oh yeah. You know, and it's part of, I think, the what I notice is it's part of depression, in it for me. And then there's the cycle of anxiety and depression, and when she was talking about how hard it was, I mean, she was talking about more than just anxiety, where
she was,
how hard it is to move, how hard it is to do something, how much sometimes when you're going through this cycle of anxiety or depression, how easy it is, or how hard it is to engage in things, how much it actually does take, the energy it takes to go pick up your kids, it is it's exhausting at times. And so, the other thing is that it does take a great deal of courage in some ways to actually then reach out for help. And my thing is if you are feeling that way, and at any moment you're feeling like, I need to call somebody, do make that call right then, because if you don't make it then, it's really, it takes energy. It takes, and I mean, it sounds like such a simple thing, but it's just not. So, and that's a reality.
And anxiety and depression spiral downward really quickly if you don't. So the ability to nip it when it's happening by calling somebody, or by taking the steps you need to calm yourself, because otherwise you get anxious about being anxious, and you just go down. Or depressed about being depressed, all that kind of stuff. And
they're combined. So, well, I remember I was kind of having, I was kind of struggling. This was early on. It was about 10 or 12 years ago, and I had a friend who was a social worker, and I was on an antidepressant, and my friend who's a social worker was like, hey, he was funny. He always liked to diagnose me and stuff, but he was like, you do know that if you exercise, that actually is better than any antidepressant. Like it will And I was like, I just remember being like, yeah, Greg, I know that. However, getting out of bed and going to the gym or going for a walk is, it's like,
I can't. Right.
just can't do it, man.
Right.
He's like, he goes, I know, that's the problem with that study.
Right.
Like, thanks, Greg.
I mean, it is true, of course, and for those of you who are listening to this, if you are prone to depression or anxiety, that, of course, exercise and eating right is very helpful for our body chemistry and brain chemistry and all that kind of stuff. So, but sometimes it's not the be-all and end-all, and sometimes we need other help.
No.
Yeah.
Well, and sometimes that becomes a problem, like she was talking about how, so she was being extra vigilant about taking care of her body, and that became part of the anxiety,
Part of the problem. I know.
So anyway, what about the fear of God that he talked about? Were you going to talk about something else?
I just want to say one more thing really quick. Let's talk about fear of God. There is a fear of picking up the phone and asking for help, especially in prideful people.
Yes.
And that's the underlying fear. And when we give into that fear, like they don't want to be bothered, or Pastor Adam or Pastor Bob just doesn't want to hear it, or it's just, then you're going to spiral. So it's better to just overcome it and pick up the phone, call somebody. Fear of God. I actually, and you could disagree. So I actually think the fear of God is both being in awe of God's hugeness, right? Vastness, infantness. But at the same time, when the shepherds encountered angels, they were terrified, not just like in awe. They were like, we're done. We're going to die kind of fear. Same with Isaiah in the temple when God shows up. There is an actual fear of the power that you are being faced with. That feels like you're gonna, and maybe it's close to a panic attack. It feels like you're gonna die in the midst of this. So I think it's both.
So the best, I don't know. One of the ways that fear of God was described, that I heard described, that I liked, was a guy was telling a story about being out in the woods behind his house when he was a kid, and there was a beehive, and he somehow disturbed the beehive, and he started running, and he was screaming, and his mom was outside doing something and heard him screaming, and she started running toward him, and he said the face his mom was making was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen in his entire life. Like, this face and the way she was running toward him, there was a part of him that thought he was in trouble almost, right? And she grabbed him up, and I don't know what the end of this, but he was, I think the idea of that look on her face, the terror that it put in him, but also, though, it was this protective kind of thing, and I didn't understand it until one day when we were living in St. Louis. My kids walked to school. We lived across the street from the school, so of course they walked, but they had to cross the street. And if anybody out there has met Oliver, he's a beautiful, beautiful boy, but doesn't always pay attention to what's going on around him. And he was about 6, and he almost, like, there was a car coming up the street, and it was a city street, so there were cars parked, parallel parked, so kids could pop out, and so parents were always really, but he stepped out into the street, and I grabbed him, by the arm, and pulled him back, and I ended up hurting him, and I was like, I could feel this tension and this almost visceral, it wasn't anger, but it was like and I'm sure that the face that I was making at the time was terrifying, but I was protecting him in that moment. And I think that is part of it too. That's part of, for me, what the fear of the Lord means.
That's an amazing story. I think you're absolutely right. That there are things that God does to yank us back from the brink of hurting ourselves, and it looks like God is being terrifying, but but deep down, it's out of God's protective love for us. And we
Yeah.
need to be able to recognize that. And yeah, I mean, of course, kids are always doing crazy, stupid things, and you're like, stop it, you know, and it looks like you're
Right.
angry, which is probably what it does look like. You're like, stop it right now. You're going to, you know, but really
Yeah.
you're concerned that they don't break a leg or, you know, punch their
Yeah.
sibling in the face kind of thing. So,
Right.
because you know that you need to step in that moment, and you need to do it with some force, you know, to make
Yeah.
it stop. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, me saying, "Oh, Oliver, don't run out into the traffic," would have done no good. He would have been hit by the car.
Yes. Right.
You know, he needed to be
Restrained.
yanked out of that situation.
Yes.
And saved from it, just like that kid needed to be yanked out of the situation of the bees running after him and saved from it. Just like, you know, sometimes I need to be yanked out of situations. And
May we
saved.
dare to pray the prayer, God, yank me out of the situations I need to be yanked out of, right? Even if it hurts. May we dare to pray that. Yeah.
Amen.
All right. Any last words? Thoughts?
Oh, no.
All
I've
right.
really appreciated this, Adam. And,
Yeah, me too. This has been
I
fun.
enjoyed this time. So,
And it's probably been more fun for us too than all the people who are watching us. But we're glad that anybody who watches this has even
Right.
gotten to this point.
Yeah.
All right. Well, have a great rest of the day, and
Yep,
peace.
you too.
Yep.
Peace. Hopefully we'll see you guys tomorrow
Yes. Bye.
if you watch this. Bye.